You aren't a soldier, and you certainly aren't a spy, at least, not a real one yet. But right now, you are telling the highest command of the Third Reich that a massive Allied fleet is gathering in a port that doesn't exist. If they believe you, the course of the war changes forever. If they find out you're lying, a Gestapo executioner will be the last person you ever see. That is exactly what happened to Juan Pujol García, known to the British as Agent Garbo, an ordinary man who changed the course of D-Day during the chaotic years leading up to June 6, 1944. To understand how a failed Spanish poultry farmer became the greatest double agent in history, we have to look at a man who hated fascism so much he decided to destroy it with nothing but his imagination. In 1941, Juan Pujol García didn't have a handler, a secret codebook, or even the support of the Allies. In fact, when he first approached the British embassy in Madrid to offer his services, they turned him away. Not once, but 3 times. They saw a man with no experience, no connections, and a background that screamed unreliable civilian. But Juan wasn't the type to take no for an answer when the fate of Europe was at stake. He realized that if he couldn't get the British to trust him, he would have to make the Germans trust him first. He traveled to Lisbon and began a daring, almost suicidal performance. He contacted the Abwehr German military intelligence and convinced them he was a pro-Nazi Spanish official who traveled frequently to London. The Germans, desperate for eyes inside the British Isles, took the bait. They gave him a code name, Alaric. They provided him with invisible ink, a stack of British pounds, and instructions to build a network of sub-agents across the UK. There was just one problem. Juan Pujol García had never been to England in his life. He didn't speak the language well, and his only knowledge of British geography came from a tourist map, a blue guide to England, and a few old railway timetables he found in a library. He stayed in Portugal, locked in his room, and began writing letters to his German handlers. He described the weather in London, the movements of ships in ports he had never seen, and the conversations of agents he had completely invented. He created Agent 7, a disgruntled Welsh mercenary, and Agent 4, a waiter at a Gibraltar cafe who supposedly overheard British officers talking. Every detail had to be perfect. If he mentioned a train leaving at 4 p.m. and the real timetable said 4:05 p.m., the Germans might smell a rat. It was a high-wire act performed over an abyss. Juan was effectively running a one-man theater troupe, playing dozens of characters at once to keep the Nazis satisfied. Surprisingly, the Germans didn't just believe him, they were impressed. They thought they had finally cracked the British intelligence wall. By the time the British MI5 realized what was happening, they were stunned. They had intercepted German radio messages discussing reports from a master spy in London that they knew didn't exist. They tracked the source back to the eccentric Spaniard in Lisbon and realized they had found a genius. In 1942, they finally brought him to London and gave him the codey name Garbo because they considered him the greatest actor in the world. But as the year 1944 approached, the stakes were no longer just about survival or small-scale deception. The Allies were planning Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. The success of the entire war rested on one question. Could Garbo convince Hitler that the real invasion was happening somewhere else? The pressure was suffocating. If the Germans moved their panzer divisions to Normandy on June 6th, the Allied soldiers on the beaches would be slaughtered. Juan sat at his desk in London, his fingers hovering over the telegraph key. The most dangerous lie of his life was about to begin. By early 1944, the secret war had reached a fever pitch. London was no longer just a city. It was a pressure cooker of hidden agendas and invisible soldiers. Juan Pujol, now firmly established as Agent Garbo, was no longer working alone in a Lisbon hotel. He was the crown jewel of the 20 Committee, the British counter-espionage team dedicated to turning German spies. To the Germans, Garbo was a hero. They believed he had managed to recruit 27 different sub-agents scattered across the United Kingdom. In reality, these 27 people existed only in Garbo's mind and in the files of MI5. He had created a fictional hierarchy of spies, each with their own personality, flaws, and specific access to information. There was 7-4, a shipping clerk in Liverpool who was supposedly an alcoholic, and a secret group of 3 anti-British extremists in Scotland. Every report Garbo sent back to his handlers in Madrid and Berlin had to be cross-referenced with the reports of his imaginary subordinates. If Agent 7-4 saw a convoy in Liverpool, Garbo had to make sure the weather he reported for that day matched the actual British meteorological records. The Germans were so convinced of Garbo's efficiency that they actually stopped trying to send other spies into England. Why risk more men when they had a master already in place? This was the ultimate trap. By trusting Garbo, the German High Command had effectively handed the keys to their intelligence gathering to the British. But the British didn't just want to hide their plans. They wanted to create a massive, terrifying hallucination for the German generals to focus on. This was the birth of Fuseg, the first United States Army group. On paper, it was a massive force of 50 divisions, over 1 million men, poised to strike at the Pas de Calais. The Pas de Calais was the most logical place for an invasion. It was the shortest distance across the English Channel, and the German V-1 rocket sites were located there. Hitler was obsessed with the Calais region. He was convinced that any move toward Normandy would merely be a feint or a distraction to pull his troops away from the real target. The Allies decided to give Hitler exactly what he expected. They created a ghost army in the fields of Kent, directly across from Calais. They built thousands of inflatable tanks made of rubber and wood. From the air, a German reconnaissance pilot would see a massive armored division ready for battle. Up close, 2 men could pick up a 4-ton tank and move it. They used heaters to create the thermal signature of engines and played recordings of tank maneuvers over massive loudspeakers. Garbo's job was to provide the soul for these rubber ghosts. He began sending frantic messages about the movements of this fake army. He reported that General George S. Petain, the general the Germans feared most, had been placed in command of Fuseg. To the Germans, this was the smoking gun. They believed the Allies would never waste a man like Patton on a diversion. Garbo described the shoulder patches the soldiers were wearing and the nicknames of the units, moving into the staging areas. He was feeding the Germans a diet of 90% truth and 10% lethal lies. He would give them real information about minor troop movements that they could verify, building a mountain of credibility. Then, when the time was right, he would use that credibility to deliver the blow that would win the war. But the psychological toll on Juan was immense. He was living a triple life, and one slip of the tongue, one inconsistent detail, would collapse the entire house of cards. He spent his days in a safe house, chain smoking and drafting reports with his handler Thomas Harris. They treated the deception like a screenplay, plotting out episodes of information. The German handlers were so pleased with Garbo's work that they informed him he had been awarded the Iron Cross Second Class. It was a staggering irony. A man working to destroy the Nazi regime was being decorated by them for his valuable services. As May 1944 turned into June, the atmospheric pressure in the secret offices of London reached a breaking point. The real Allied fleet was gathering in the southwest, near Portsmouth and Southampton, while the fake fleet sat in the southeast. The date was set. The ships were loaded. Millions of lives now depended on whether a Spanish farmer could keep the German 15th Army sitting uselessly in Calais while the world burned in Normandy. The final days of May 1944 felt like the seconds before a lightning strike. The English countryside was bursting with men, steel, and a silence so heavy it felt physical. In the secret nerve center of the 20 Committee, Juan Pujol sat at a desk stained with coffee rings and ash. He knew the invasion was imminent. though he didn't know the exact hour. His task was now surgical. He had to keep the German High Command's eyes locked firmly on the Pas de Calais, even as the Allied ships began to groan under the weight of their cargo. To do this, Garbo intensified the noise from his fictional network. His imaginary agents were suddenly seeing things everywhere. Agent 7, the Welshman, reported heavy troop movements in the east. Agent 4 sent word of specialized landing craft being tested in the Dover area. Every message was designed to reinforce Hitler's pre-existing bias. The Führer wanted to believe the blow would fall at Calais, and Garbo was giving him a masterpiece of confirmation. But the Germans weren't just listening. They were watching. German reconnaissance planes, the few that managed to slip past the RAF, were bringing back photos of the rubber tanks. The Ghost Army was performing its role perfectly. From 30,000 feet, those inflatable Shermans looked like a steel fist ready to punch through the Atlantic Wall. Garbo added the sensory details. He reported on the morale of these fake troops, their complaints about the rations, and their excitement about the upcoming Channel crossing to Calais. He was no longer just a spy. He was a director of a continental theater. But then the weather turned. A massive storm rolled into the English Channel, the worst in 20 years. The invasion, originally set for June 5th, had to be postponed. For Juan, this was a moment of pure terror. If the Germans noticed a sudden drop in radio traffic or a change in his agents' reports, they might realize the movement they were tracking had stalled. He had to explain the delay without making it look like a delay of an invasion that wasn't actually happening where he said it was. The stress began to take a physical toll. Juan's hands shook as he lit his cigarettes. He was sleeping 3 hours a night, his mind a labyrinth of 27 different lies. He knew that across the water, Field Marshal Rommel and the German 15th Army were waiting. 250,000 German soldiers were sitting in Calais, eyes fixed on the horizon. If those soldiers moved just 150 miles to the west, the Allied landing at Normandy would become a graveyard. On the night of June 5th, the weather cleared just enough. General Eisenhower gave the order, "Okay, let's go." As the largest armada in human history began to move toward the beaches of Normandy, Juan Pujol prepared for his most daring move yet. He had arranged a special radio schedule with his German handlers in Madrid for 3 a.m. on June 6th. He intended to send a warning that the invasion was starting, but he would send it just late enough that the Germans couldn't react in time, yet early enough to prove his loyalty. He sat in the dark, the rhythm of the Morse code echoing in his ears. This was the moment of truth. He tapped out the call sign. He waited for the response. Madrid stayed silent. The German operator on the other end had gone to sleep. He wasn't at his post. Juan was furious. He was trying to save the German army from a surprise attack to maintain his cover, and the Nazis were literally napping while the world changed. The irony was bitter. The man who had spent years lying to them was now desperate to tell them a truth that would arrive too late to save them, but just in time to solidify his status as their most trusted source. The sun began to rise over the coast of France. The first paratroopers were already hitting the ground. The great deception was about to meet reality. The sun began to crest over the English Channel on the morning of June 6, 1944. Thousands of Allied ships were emerging from the morning mist off the coast of Normandy, unleashing a firestorm of steel. But back in London, Juan Pujol García was in a state of calculated, cold-blooded rage. He had spent the entire night trying to reach his handlers in Madrid to deliver his urgent warning. Because the German operator had missed the 3 a.m. window, the news of the invasion was now breaking through official military channels. To any other spy, this would be a disaster. If your information arrives after the event, you are useless. But Garbo was a master of psychology. He didn't apologize. He attacked. At 8 a.m., he finally established contact. His fingers flew over the telegraph key, hammering out a message dripping with indignation and professional insult. "I cannot tolerate these excuses," he tapped out. "The negligence of your radio operator is beyond belief. I have risked my life to bring you the most critical information of the war, and you were sleeping. I am disgusted. I am finished with this service." It was a brilliant bluff. By acting like a slighted professional, he convinced the Germans that he had indeed known about the invasion beforehand. The Abwehr handlers were mortified. They spent the next few hours begging Garbo for forgiveness, reinforcing their belief that he was their most vital asset. Meanwhile, the slaughter had begun on the beaches of Omaha and Juneau. The Allied forces were struggling to gain a foothold against the Atlantic Wall. The German 15th Army, the most powerful force in the region, was still sitting in the Pas de Calais, just a few hours' drive from the real battle. The German generals were paralyzed by a single question. Was Normandy the real invasion, or just a diversion for the real strike at Calais? This was the moment Juan Pujol had been preparing for since he left his chicken farm in Spain. He began sending new reports from his network. He claimed that his agents in the southeast of England were seeing the real army Fusag still preparing to move. He told the Germans that the Normandy landings were a trap designed to pull the German reserves away from Calais. He argued that the Allies were sacrificing thousands of men in Normandy just to trick Hitler into leaving the back door open at the Dover-Calais crossing. It sounded insane, but it fit perfectly with Hitler's own paranoia. The Führer had always said Calais was the target. Garbo wasn't just giving them news. He was giving them an excuse to stay where they were. In the German headquarters, the tension was breaking. General Jodl and the High Command were looking at Garbo's reports alongside the bloody maps of Normandy. Because of Garbo's reputation, his intelligence was given higher priority than the actual reports of 150,000 Allied soldiers landing in Normandy. The order was given. The 15th Army must stay in Calais. The panzer divisions that could have crushed the Normandy beachhead stayed in their garages. Juan sat in his London office, listening to the radio reports of the casualties. He knew that for every hour he kept the Germans in Calais, hundreds of Allied lives were being saved. But the deception wasn't over. He had to keep the lie alive for days, even weeks, if the invasion was to succeed. If the Germans realized the mistake within the first 48 hours, they could still counterattack and drive the Allies back into the sea. Juan took a deep breath, lit another cigarette, and began drafting the next report from his fictional Agent 3, a man who didn't exist, reporting on a fleet that wasn't there. The sun set on June 6th, but the battle for the truth was only beginning. While the Allies had secured a fragile toehold in Normandy, they were still incredibly vulnerable. History books often suggest the deception ended when the first boots hit the sand, but for Juan Pujol, his most impossible task lay ahead. He had to keep the German 15th Army stationary for not just hours, but weeks. The German High Command was beginning to panic. As the days passed, it became clear that the Normandy landings were massive, too massive to be a simple distraction. Field Marshal von Rundstedt and Rommel began pleading for reinforcements. They wanted the elite divisions from the Pas de Calais to move south and crush the Allied bridgehead. But Juan, working with his Mi-5 handler, crafted a message so bold it seemed suicidal. On June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, he sent a top-secret summary to Berlin. He claimed that his sub-agents had seen the real main force still in England. He argued that the Normandy operation was a brilliant Allied trick to soak up German reserves. The present operations are a diversionary maneuver, Garbo tapped out. The objective is to lure the German forces into a trap so that the main attack can be launched at the Pas de Calais. This message didn't just go to intelligence officers. It went directly to Hitler's desk at the Wolf's Lair. Hitler, who prided himself on his military intuition, was delighted. Garbo had told him exactly what he wanted to hear, that he was right all along about Calais. The result was one of the most disastrous military decisions of the war. Hitler personally overrode his generals and ordered the 1st SS Panzer Division and the 15th Army to stay put, while the Allies were desperately unloading tanks and supplies on the beaches. The most powerful German units in France were literally sitting in their barracks, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Juan was essentially playing a high-stakes game of poker with the lives of millions on the line. Every day he held the German gaze. The Allied line in Normandy grew stronger. But the Germans weren't stupid. They began asking why the main force in England hadn't moved yet. Garbo had to invent reasons. He reported delays in loading, weather complications, and even internal Allied disputes between Eisenhower and Patton. He was weaving a tapestry of lies so thick that the German intelligence agencies began to ignore their own aerial reconnaissance in favor of Garbo's reports. By late June, the Ghost Army in Kent was still sending fake radio traffic, and Garbo was still confirming every word of it. For 7 full weeks after D-Day, the bulk of the German 15th Army remained in the Pas de Calais. By the time Hitler finally realized the truth and moved those troops, it was too late. The Allies had built up enough strength to break out of Normandy and begin the race toward Paris. Juan Pujol had done what no army could. He had defeated the German High Command using only a radio and his own imagination. But as the German front began to collapse, the danger for Juan changed. The man who was a hero to the Nazis was now in danger of being rescued or discovered by the very regime he was destroying. As the Allied armies shattered the German lines and began their lightning-fast sweep across France, the irony of Juan Pujol's situation reached a point of absolute absurdity. The Third Reich was crumbling. Its cities were being reduced to rubble, and its generals were facing the total collapse of their military might. Yet, in their eyes, one man remained a beacon of hope: Agent Alaric. Despite the fact that his intelligence had led them to a strategic catastrophe, the German High Command didn't blame Garbo. They blamed their own inability to act on his warnings fast enough. In July 1944, Juan received a message that almost made him laugh out loud in his London safe house. For his extraordinary services and his tireless efforts to warn them of the Calais invasion, Adolf Hitler himself had authorized the award of the Iron Cross Second Class to Juan Pujol. Because Juan was in enemy territory, he couldn't attend a ceremony. His German handlers informed him via radio that the medal would be held for him until the final victory. The British MI5 officers were floored. They had successfully managed a double agent who was now being decorated by the very enemy he was systematically dismantling. But the British weren't about to be outdone by the Nazis. King George VI, having been briefed on the staggering success of Operation Fortitude, decided that Juan deserved the highest recognition of the British Empire as well. In a secret ceremony, the king appointed Juan Pujol García as an honorary member of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, MBE. Juan became one of the few people in history, perhaps the only one, to be decorated by both the Allies and the Axis powers during World War II. But as the war moved into its final months, the Garbo network faced a new problem: how to stop lying. If Garbo suddenly went silent, the Germans might realize they had been duped and target him for assassination. Or worse, his family back in Spain could be at risk. He had to wind down the operation with the same cinematic flair he had used to start it. He began reporting that his sub-agents were being arrested by the British police, one by one. He described the terror of the London raids and the closing of the net around him. He even staged a narrow escape where he claimed to have moved his radio equipment just minutes before Mi-5 smashed down his door. By the time the Soviet flag was raised over the Reichstag in 1945, the Alaric network was a ghost of a ghost. The Germans, in their final bunkers, were still asking for Alaric's opinion on Allied movements, clinging to his lies until the very second the radio stopped transmitting. With the war over, the man who had built an army of 27 ghosts was no longer needed. But the world was now a very dangerous place for a man who knew too many secrets. The Nazis who survived would eventually realize how they had been fooled. The Spanish government was still under Franco's rule. Juan Pujol was a man without a safe country to call home. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in May 1945, Juan Pujol García found himself in a position that was as prestigious as it was terrifying. He was a hero of the British Empire, but he was also a man who had personally humiliated the most dangerous people on the planet. The remnants of the Gestapo and the Abwehr were being hunted, but many were slipping through the cracks, fleeing to South America, or hiding in the shadows of a divided Germany. Juan knew that if any of these die hard, Nazis discovered that their Iron Cross hero was actually the man who orchestrated the D-Day disaster. His life expectancy would be measured in minutes. Even more complicated was his personal life. His wife, Araceli, had struggled immensely with the isolation and secrecy of their life in London. She had once even threatened to go to the Spanish embassy and reveal everything just so she could go home. The pressure of living a lie had nearly broken them both. With the help of MI5, Juan realized that as long as Agent Garbo was alive, he would always be a target. He needed one final, ultimate act of deception. In 1949, a report began to circulate through diplomatic channels and reach the ears of his former handlers and even his own family. The report stated that Juan Pujol García had traveled to Angola, where he had tragically contracted malaria and died. It was the perfect end for a man whose life had become a series of ghost stories. The world mourned him or forgot him, and the file on the world's greatest double agent was closed. But there was no body in Angola. There was no malaria. In reality, Juan had moved to Venezuela. He didn't move as a decorated war hero or a master of espionage. He moved as a ghost. He settled in the town of Lagunillas and later moved to Caracas. He opened a small bookstore and a gift shop. He lived a quiet, unassuming life, masquerading as just another Spanish immigrant who had fled the hardships of post-war Europe. To his neighbors, he was a polite, slightly reserved man who enjoyed literature and took care of his business. None of them, not even his new family, had any idea that the man selling them books was the same man who had looked Adolf Hitler in the eye through a telegraph key and won. For 36 years, the secret held. The Agent Garbo files remained classified in the UK, and the world believed Juan Pujol was buried in the African soil. But history has a way of refusing to stay buried. In the early 1980s, a British politician and historian named Nigel West began to suspect that the death in Angola was too convenient. He began a global manhunt for a dead man, following a trail of breadcrumbs that led across the Atlantic to the bustling streets of Caracas. For over 3 decades, the legend of Agent Garbo was a closed chapter in the history of the Great War. To the British public, he was a mythic figure who died in the tropics. To the German veterans, he was a lost hero. But in 1984, Nigel West, a persistent intelligence historian, wasn't buying the story. He had spent years digging through the newly declassified MI5 files and noticed something odd. There was no official record of a death certificate from Angola. West tracked down Juan's former MI5 handler, Thomas Harris, but Harris had died in a car accident years earlier. Finally, through a series of contacts in the Spanish expatriate community, West found a lead that pointed toward Venezuela. In a quiet suburb of Caracas, a man named Juan Pujol was living a peaceful life, surrounded by his children and grandchildren. He was a shopkeeper, a father, a man who rarely spoke of the past. When Nigel West finally tracked him down and made contact, the elderly Spaniard was hesitant. The habits of a lifetime of deception are hard to break. But once he realized the world finally knew the truth, and that the Nazi threat was truly a ghost of the past, Juan agreed to come back from the dead. In June 1984, exactly 40 years after the D-Day landings, a thin, dignified man with thick glasses stepped off a plane at Heathrow Airport in London. The dead spy had returned. The British government, realizing the magnitude of the moment, treated him like the VIP he had always been. The climax of his return was an incredibly emotional visit to Normandy. Walking along the sands of Omaha and Gold Beach, Juan looked out at the water where thousands of ships had once gathered because of his lies. He stood among the white crosses of the American cemetery at Colville-sur-Mer. For the first time, he saw the physical cost of the liberation he had helped facilitate. Veterans who had survived the landings shook his hand, many with tears in their eyes, realizing that they might not be standing there if the German 15th Army hadn't been waiting for a ghost army in Calais. The man who had spent his life pretending to be 27 different people finally only had to be himself. The highlight of the trip was a private audience at Buckingham Palace. Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh, received him to personally acknowledge the debt the nation owed to the poultry farmer from Spain. Juan was amazed to find that his story had become a cornerstone of military intelligence training. He was no longer a secret. He was a masterclass. But even as he stood in the halls of power, Juan remained humble. He often said he didn't do it for the medals or the fame. He did it because he couldn't stand to see a world ruled by a dictator. As he prepared to return to his quiet life in Venezuela, there was one final task: to close the loop on the greatest deception in history. Juan Pujol, a middle-aged man with dark, receding hair, a neat mustache, an average build, and an intense, focused expression, wearing a simple 1940s suit, Juan Pujol García returned to Venezuela after his brief moment in the global spotlight. But he was no longer a ghost. He was a living legend, finally able to share his secret with his children. He spent his final years in Caracas, living modestly, the same way he had for decades. He didn't seek riches from his story. The satisfaction of knowing he had tilted the scales of history was enough. On December 15th, 1988, the man who had died for the first time in 1949 passed away for real at the age of 76. He was buried in Coroni, a small town on the Caribbean coast. Today, his legacy is etched into the very foundation of modern intelligence. Operation Fortitude is still studied in military academies as the gold standard of strategic deception. The sheer scale of his achievement remains unparalleled. Without firing a single shot, a civilian with no formal training kept the most powerful army in Europe paralyzed, while the fate of the free world was decided on a strip of French sand. Juan Pujol proved that in the theater of war, the mind is often more powerful than the machine. He turned his imagination into a shield for thousands of young men he would never meet. He remains the only person to ever hold both the Iron Cross from Germany and the MBE from Britain. A permanent, physical reminder of a lie so perfect it saved a continent? In an era of high-tech surveillance and satellite imagery, his story reminds us that the human element, courage, wit, and a refusal to stay silent in the face of tyranny is the ultimate weapon. The next time you see the sweeping cliffs of Normandy or the quiet fields of Kent, remember the Spanish farmer who built an army out of thin air. He was the spy who saved D-Day, the actor who fooled a dictator, and the man who proved that one person, armed only with conviction and a radio, can change the world. If you believe that the bravest soldiers aren't always the ones carrying rifles, show your support for these incredible true stories. Hit the like button if Agent Garbo's audacity surprised you. And subscribe to join us as we uncover more hidden chapters of history that the world almost forgot. Comment below. Do you think a deception on this scale would be possible today with modern technology? Or was Juan Pujol a once-in-a-century genius?